This is the default behavior in Entity Framework. Why did they make it the default? Not only me, I think many people are asking this question, because usually it's a bad thing. In some cases, yes. Like I'm selecting something, and after a couple of lines, I'm selecting, depending on if statement, let's say. If the if is wrong, then I'm not going to call it. So if it's like 200 customers, and then I'm going to select the orders only for like 5 or 3, this could be a good way of handling, right? So this is called lazy loading, which is the default. How can I override that? Let's say for my example, I want to load everything together. So in one statement, give me all customers and all their orders. If you want to do that, you can use something called eager loading. And the only difference is this red statement. When you're saying from customers, say dot include orders. So it goes on the entity framework, and it detects that there is a relationship between customer and order. So the SQL statement generated will have an inner join, and it will bring all the data together. Again, depending on the case, this could be a very expensive also statement, right? So you have to be careful. You have to know what to use. So this is eager loading. The third type is called the explicit loading. The only difference in explicit loading is that you are calling it directly. So let's say, as you can see here, for each customer, display the company name. Now I want to load the orders. Again, you can do an if statement, right? If something, then load. This, remember, these kinds of things, these kinds of tips are the things that will really make the difference between Entity Framework. I see many people saying, I did this application, I'm trying to compare, and the difference is huge. No, you have to know exactly how to use ADO.NET and how to use Entity Framework before deciding to compare both. So this is the most expensive operation that I usually find. Another thing is called no tracking. Just to explain to you very quickly about the architecture of Entity Framework, in normal SQL statements or ADO.NET, you use a select, right? So it goes to the SQL server, it executes, and it caches the statement, right? Store procedure or whatever you have there. So the cache is where? On the database side. Do you have caching on your machine? No. With Entity Framework, this is different. The query, the Entity Framework prepares a query, right? A query in its own language, link language. And then it translates this to a select that sends it there. Now, when it does that, it keeps the statement in its own cache. So now you have cache on your machine. You have to understand this, because this really makes a difference. I'm going to show you later on how to compile your statement so that the next time the execution will be faster. It has the same concept as in your database. So remember, if you have a statement that you are using multiple times, to cache it, compile it, or recompile. One thing you can do is use the no tracking option. Now, what does this option mean? It means simply, when you're loading objects like customer or order into memory, the Entity Framework starts monitoring it, because you might update it, right? You might update the object. For example, I'm going to say name equals whatever. And then I might say save changes. Save changes means go now to the database and update. So it records everything that is happening to your object so that it becomes easy to update. If you're going to only read data, is this a good idea? I'm just going to read. I'm not planning on modifying. And tracking is an expensive operation. So if you're sure you're going to just read the data and not going to do anything, for example, display it on a list box or on a grid, whatever, don't do that. And for web applications, this is usually the case. In web applications, I can say that in more than 90% of the cases, you're reading data, right? So make sure if that's the case to use this option. Again, you can see it here in the context.customers.merge option equals no tracking. So before doing anything, reading or whatever, do this. Say no tracking and then start reading. This will make your application work a lot faster. Another tip. Sometimes for people who are advanced, especially with SQL Server, you see the thing about Entity Framework, if you use a normal select, direct and from entity framework, the difference is minimum. But once you get to bigger and bigger queries with multiple objects, multiple tables, the statement becomes more and more complex. You know, if you try it at home with your tables, you will see that it's a select from, another select from. You will see a lot of selects getting into each other. Once it gets complex, the performance difference becomes bigger and bigger between your normal statements and the entity framework. In some cases, especially if you know what you're doing, it's a good idea to just tell entity framework, stop, I want to run my own statement. Okay? But you don't want to just define a connection. You can still use the entity framework and tell it your own command. As you can see in the first line, that's what I'm doing. I'm saying context.execute store query. And as you can see, select start from product, where PID, product ID equals some parameter. So you can do that, and you should do that. In some cases, you should do that. Ignore the entity framework and do your own statements. That's what I've seen many people doing. They start with the application, everything is entity framework. This part suffers from performance problems. They go in and they start using, execute store query. So that's one way of handling it. Also, there's something you should know about, which is, yes?
What if I update the entity framework? I need to create.
Yes, if you are returning the object, as you can see here, I'm returning the type of product. So the tracking option is there. But make sure to specify the right one, as I told you. One more thing is called a DB data reader. Now, this is a data reader that is specific for entity framework. It's not your normal data reader. It returns an entity type. The thing I'm focusing on here is entity type statements. You can just ignore that and open your own connections, commands, and run it. That's another option. Okay, so that's another thing you can use in some part. Another part is, in many cases, you are selecting, let's imagine this. You have a grid, you're selecting an order, and you want to open another page for that order. So what you're searching for is the ID, right? Now, many people will just go and say, select where the ID is equal, as I'm doing in the first line. See, create a customer from customers where the customer ID equals 3, and get me, the first record. Now, this is right, this will work, but this will not give you the best performance. If you're planning on getting objects by their ID, by their key, the primary key, there is a better way to do it, which is the second line. You can see that the second line is not as readable. Context.getObjectByKey, get me the key from customers, named customer ID, and put it to 3. Now, you're sacrificing readability for performance. It's your choice. You can use that. It's better performance, but whenever I see strings, you have to write stuff that is not auto-complete, I start feeling worried. So that's why many people just ignore using this. Now, the good thing about Entity Framework 4.1, they've defined a new context. The context is, as you saw, the one that I always use to call tables, context dot. There's something called DB context. See the third line. Customer equals context.customers.find3. This is much better, right? This is one of the improvements in 4.1. It's a new context class, which is much better. It has, much better features that you can use, and still you can use the old object if you need to. So that's why I'm telling you, try to download it and play with it. It's a really nice. It has really nice features and properties and methods. Okay, but what's the difference? Why are these two faster than the first one? It's not just because I was waiting for someone to ask me this question. As developers, we should ask.
I think it's mapping the table of customer to entity framework and handling the ID with function find by value.
No, actually, find does a similar approach to the second line.
Yes.
But the thing is, your data might be already here on your cache, right? The data might be already there. So when you're using the first one, it will always go to the database and bring it again. While in the second and in the other two, it will search for on your